Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this important and timely conversation. I'm Adrienne Arsht, Executive Vice Chair of the Atlantic Council and founder of the Atlantic Council's Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center and the Adrienne Arsht Latin America Center. I join you today from Washington, D.C. The Arsht Rock Resilience Team is in Glasgow for COP26. And although it doesn't look like DC, my background I put in is my house in Miami. I had to be where the action is. I'm thrilled that my friend, Mayor Daniela Levine Cava of Miami-Dade County, recently announced the first ever heat season, not related to the basketball team, for Miami-Dade to evaluate the risk of heat, especially as it intersects with hurricanes. I'm very proud of the work that they are doing at COP26, all of you and all of you around the world, to protect the most vulnerable people from extreme heat. It is, not surprisingly, known as the silent killer. The heat waves we have seen around the world this year have been shocking and a wake-up call for the action we need to take. In Portland, Oregon, temperatures reached a record 116 degrees Fahrenheit, and Western Canada heated up to 120 degrees, resulting in over 1,000 deaths. Every city faces challenges when it comes to heat. In my longtime home of Miami, Florida, hurricane risk is seen as the main threat. So our residents there may not be focused on preparing for heat waves. Jane, I know you're going to change that. But as Mayor Levine Cava of Miami-Dade County recently announced, heat season is a danger to our community, often even more than the risk of hurricanes. The good news is that actionable solutions exist to deal with extreme heat, and we are working to share and scale these solutions. Arsht Rock is partnering with cities around the world to appoint Chief Heat Officers, CHO. The first Chief Heat Officer was named in Miami-Dade County, followed closely by Chief Heat Officers in Athens, Greece, and Freetown, Sierra Leone. These Chief Heat Officers will wake up every day focused on protecting residents of their cities from extreme heat. I'm delighted that all three CHOs have joined us today with Kathy Buffin-McLeod, our inimitable director, and I look forward to this conversation. And now it's my pleasure to turn to Mauricio Rodas, the former mayor of Quito, Ecuador, and the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center's lead on his City Champions for Heat Action initiative. Mauricio?
Thank you so much, Adrienne, for your vision, your leadership, and your efforts to build resilience and save thousands of lives around the world. We're standing here today with the COP26 venue behind us, where the global leaders have gathered to discuss climate change and ways in which the world can address our greatest threat. Cities are aware that they generate more than 70% of total global CO2 emissions. And during this COP, it has become evident the pivotal role that cities should play to tackle climate change. We've seen mayors and local authorities showcasing their initiatives in this regard. Last week, on Tuesday, the Adrienne Arsht Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, Arsht Rock, was delighted to host a session with a fantastic group of mayors that are making a difference to address the climate-related hazard that kills more people than all other combined extreme heat. We had with us Mayor Daniela Levin Cava from Miami-Dade County, Mayor Kostas Bakuyanis from Athens, Mayor Ivona Kisoyer from Freetown, as well as a video broadcasting from Mayor Juan Espadas from Seville, sharing with us the kind of actions that they are undertaking under a new initiative that was launched by the Arch Rocks Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance, which is City Champions for Heat Action, through which they are not only doing work locally to address heat, but also motivating their fellow mayors in their respective continents to do the same. We heard from Mayor Levin Cava a very exciting announcement. She's going to establish a heat season in her city next May to raise awareness about heat-related risks. We heard from Mayor Bakuyanis about his collaboration with Arch Rock to develop a heat wave categorization system, something similar to what Seville is doing. We also heard from Mayor Aki Sawyer about Freetown, the Tree Town, an initiative to plant more than 1 million trees in her city, engaging the community to protect those trees. During the past few months, we've also seen how the mayors of Miami-Dade County, Athens, and Freetown appointed the first ever group of chief heat officers to work on a daily basis to address heat in their cities, to build heat health related task force and work across municipal departments on this issue. We are particularly thrilled that this group of chief heat officers are all women, because it is women the most affected by extreme heat. We are very happy to have this fantastic group of chief heat officers with us today to keep building upon the conversation we had last week with the mayors. For that, I would like to hand it over to Kathy Bowman-McLeod, Senior Vice President and Director of the Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, to moderate this panel. And you'll see the passion and drive she has, the contagious motivation she has to save people from extreme heat. Over to you, Kathy.
Hi, I'm Kathy Boffman-McLeod. I'm the director of the Adrian Arch Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center. Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you, Adrian, especially for the inspiration you give us every day. We wouldn't be able to do what we're doing without you. A special thanks goes to the Rockefeller Foundation for their support as well. Welcome to Glasgow. Behind me, you see the city. We're one day from the final day of the COP26, and this conversation is the perfectly timed for what's happening here in Glasgow and at the COP. Our mission at the Arch Rock Center is to build the human capacity for resilience in the face of climate change. To build the human capacity, that's important for today. And we've set a goal of reaching 1 billion people with resilient solutions to climate impacts by 2030. And what makes it so relevant today is that part of this COP and every COP is a set of high-level global champions who champion the work of non-governmental parties, the private sector and nonprofits like us. This year, the Race to Resilience is the sibling campaign to the Race to Zero. And we always hear about mitigation and the Race to Zero, the efforts we have to make to reduce emissions that are heating up the planet. And while we work to do that and face the pessimism of where we are, the Race to Resilience is giving us hope, because for the first time ever in climate COP and the UNFCCC world in history, the progress on climate action is being measured by human lives. It's not solely measured any longer by metric tons of carbon or dollars deployed in climate finance. That's a big moment for us, particularly as an initiative that's a member of the Race to Resilience, as the Extreme Heat Resilience Alliance. And as you've heard from Adrian and Mauricio, heat is killing more people than any other climate hazard. And in some countries, more than all of them combined. And this silent killer can't be silent if we are to solve it and protect people. And so when we think about that human metric and we think about protecting people from heat, one of the very best ways that we see that climate action is through leadership. And real climate action that's measurable has to have leadership. And 3 cities, as you've heard, have shown that leadership. 3 mayors, Mayor Daniela Levine Cava of Miami-Dade County, Mayor Kostas Bakoyannis of Athens, and Mayor Yvonne Aki Sawyer of Freetown, Sierra Leone, have shown immense leadership in appointing the first ever chief heat officers. And so today, as we look at a close to this COP26 and what happens as we continue to protect people from this deadly risk as the temperatures around the world grow, and the hope in the leadership we see embodied in these 3 women leaders and what they do in their communities, I am thrilled to host this conversation today to learn more about what that climate action looks like on the ground in their cities. So let me first go to Jane Gilbert and ask Jane, tell us what's happening in your community and what does heat look like?
Thank you, Kathy. So Greater Miami, as you can see in our background, has been known internationally for its risk to sea level rise, hurricanes, and storm surge. And we've been addressing those concerns for decades now in a very strong way. But even back in 2016, when I became Chief Resilience Officer for City of Miami, the risks of extreme heat were not really on our radar. And then a couple of years later, as I was developing the climate adaptation strategy for the City of Miami, we did workshops in neighborhoods throughout the city, listening to people about their top concerns related to climate change. And heat actually came up a lot, particularly the compound risks between hurricanes and heat. Just the year before, we had Hurricane Irma, and we had a widespread and extended power outage, and people died. We lost 12 people in particular in a nursing home. We've since been able to put in the policies in place to ensure that all assisted living and nursing homes are protected, but we have many more vulnerable people out there. And we've always known heat, it's a tropical climate, and we don't get the extremes like we saw in the Northwest in the US. But what we get is we have the majority of our population is struggling to pay their bills. And as utility rates go up, and the demand for air conditioning goes up, less and less people are able to afford it. They're not able to pay rent, let alone their utility bills that are increasing. So they're choosing not to, even if they have pulmonary or heart conditions that really from a health perspective require to have access to cooling. So there's risk in people's homes, there's risk in people's workplace. We have over 300,000 outdoor workers, and then also many workers in restaurants and warehouses that are in heat conditions that are unsafe, increasingly unsafe. And then finally, with the intense urbanization and growth that has happened in Greater Miami, we have urban heat islands where the temperatures can be 5 to 7 degrees centigrade hotter than other areas of the city. And if you need to go to a bus stop, if you're a mom needing to bring your kids to a playground or even just walk your dogs, it becomes untenable and it becomes unbearable for months of the year. So we have a lot of work to do in our housing, in our workplaces, in our urban landscapes to mitigate heat. And then finally, to deal with the episodic risk of a widespread and extended power outage to make sure we have both the social and physical infrastructure to protect our population.
Wonderful. That was a full look at what you're facing. Wow. Yeah. But I applaud you and the mayor, and the heat season's exciting, and I want to get into that in the next round. But let me turn to Lenyo Mirvili, Chief Heat Officer of Athens, to hear about what heat looks like in Athens and the work you're undertaking. Lenyo. You're on mute, Lenyo, I'm afraid.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be with you. So the story of heat in Athens
Thank you so much, Adrian, for your vision, your leadership,
I guess one could
efforts
start
to build
from this
resilience
summer,
and save
where we had this
thousands of
really
lives
long
around
heat
the
wave
world.
that reached a
We're
44
standing
degrees
here
Celsius
today with the COP26 venue
peak
behind
temperatures,
us.
and it actually was a very long, heat wave as well. We had 2,300 excess deaths this summer in a period of 2.5 to 3 weeks between the end of July and the middle of August. That wasn't just Athens, it was the whole of Greece. We don't have data for Athens right now, but we also, as probably most of you know, had these enormous mega fires that were at the edges of our town, which were a result of, they were basically linked to this long period of heat that we had this summer and the preceding heat wave, with no humidity in the air at all. So the fire, the forest just kind of ignited, and these big fires burned acres and acres of land around Athens and all around Greece. So this is kind of the end of the story. The story of heat in Athens is the story of a city that was getting hotter and hotter in time because of climate change, and it's also the story of an urbanity, a city that became more and more urban. So between the 1950s and today, this city grew just in a few decades. Between the 1950s and the 1990s, basically in 3-4 decades, the city moved from being a few dozen thousand people to almost 4 million people. So it was a really rapid explosion of urbanity, and it's densely built and densely populated. It's the most densely populated city after Paris. And it's a city full of cement and full of asphalt that basically locks in temperatures and has locks in heat and has a very high urban heat island phenomenon, which sometimes makes the city 10 degrees warmer at the center of the city than the outskirts of the city, which is an enormous difference. It's a city that, of course, has an area which is a more central area that has more green and has and is the more affluent area of the city. And as is often the case in many cities around the world, there is the part of the city that has less
Thank
green.
You so much, Adrian,
Which
for your
also,
vision, your leadership,
has a
and your
confluence
efforts
of different
to build
challenges,
resilience and
which
save
are
thousands of
socioeconomic
lives
mostly,
around the world.
but
We're standing here today
as
with the
we
COP26
know,
venue behind us.
as we very well know, the people that work in cities, it's kind of almost clear that when you look at the city, you can kind of figure out where the richest part of the city is, because that's where the most green is. So, and the poorest parts of the cities are usually the parts of the city that don't have any green areas. And so we really have a lot of people that live live in parts of Athens that have very little green, and there are a lot of people. We have a large percentage of energy poverty in Athens. We have about 24% of our population doesn't have enough money, as Jane was saying, to actually turn on the air conditioning if they have one. And we also have a lot of people that live alone. We have a lot of people in above 60. So we are a city that has young people, but it also has a really large older population, which are quite vulnerable. A lot of them live alone and are pensioners and have very, very,
Thank you
very
so
small
much,
pensions.
Adrian, for your
And,
vision, your world.
And then we also have a lot
We're
of people,
standing here
again, as
today
Jane said, that
with the
work
COP26
outdoors
venue
or
behind
indoors
us,
and
where
have work physically, manual labor. So Athens is a city that part of its beauty is that it's outside. A lot of the life is the life of being in the outside spaces. So we have a lot of people that work outside in the summer, but also just people that do menial work in areas that are not ventilated or are not built in ways that actually do not have heating. Basically, this summer showed us that the heat that we are expecting in the city makes life unlivable for everybody. Like, there are the people that are definitely the most vulnerable, that we're worried about them ending up in hospitals or even dying. But it's a city that, in order to save itself for everybody, we have to make it. I believe that part of my role is to push it in a way that makes the city more beautiful and more livable for everybody as well.
That's a beautiful vision. That is a beautiful vision. And let's move to Eugenia and tell us about, you're just in this role for less than a month, so it's all out in front, but you face these things every day, and your context is different. And tell us about how this role unfolds for you in Freetown. Oh, and you are on mute, my dear.
Thank you very much, Kathy. As it's been said, extreme heat is affecting millions of people all around the world, and city are the most affected. Extreme heat is a climate hazard that is affecting residents in Freetown. The city, it is not a stranger to city. The city has reached records of 41 degrees Celsius, and it's affecting the environment, it's affecting the health, and it's affecting livelihood. 65% of Sierra Leone's population depend on subsistence agriculture. And heat has caused a lot of rural-urban migration and led to the expansion of the city. We now have 72 informal settlements in Freetown. 35% of the city population live in the informal settlement, and these are areas that are located around the hillsides and seasides and are very prone to disaster. These are the people that are affected the most by extreme heat, as they do not have the resources to purchase cooling items and they live in houses built from zinc. Extreme heat is really causing a lot of issues in Freetown. And as the Chief Heat Officer for Freetown, we are working together with communities in Freetown, vulnerable communities, to ensure that we reduce the impact of heat in Freetown. It is causing a lot of death, and is one of the reasons for malaria. And malaria is one of the major killing disease, not only in Sierra Leone, but also in Africa. So we'll be working with communities to ensure that we drive the plan in the community level.
Thank you very much, Eugenia. As we were saying, these challenges are interrelated, and we say that heat is the mothership of climate risk, and some of this, as you play it out and see the temperatures going up, it gets pretty daunting. You said mosquito-borne illness and worker productivity, and but one of the things that we know about adaptation, and just thinking about climate action and what climate adaptation resilience work looks like, we know that it is driven by the communities, and oftentimes it needs to, it may not be bespoke, but it is absolutely has to be tailored to the community, because every community is different. And so Jane, let me go back to you and just ask about the stakeholder environment. You know, what's the role of the stakeholders in the CHO as it unfolds for you?
Great question. It is so important, and I'm really blessed here in Greater Miami with an incredible level of partnerships. So last year, a group of community-based organizations, a coalition that's called the Climate and Health Equity Coalition, did a series of focus groups and interviews with low-income and otherwise disadvantaged populations throughout the county to better understand what their top concerns were related to climate change. And extreme heat and displacement were their top two concerns. That coalition has since grown and is a partner in everything that we're doing. They've already helped create a heat policy platform for us to work on. Secondly, our university partners actually created an urban heat research group that has helped us to understand what our data and research availability is and what our needs are. We've set up we're about to have our first meeting of our climate and heat health task force. And that has members from our National Weather Service, who we've been working with on upping their messaging and daily hazard reports around heat, our Department of Health, our university partners, our community-based organizations. And we just finished a round of applications from the community, from members who have experienced heat, whether it's in their homes, their workplace, how they get to and from work, et cetera. And we had 53 applications for those 2 community member slots. And the stories were quite telling to hear from each of them, but that they will be key members of this 15-member task force as we go forward. Luckily, we have the experience as Chief Resilience Officer of the city. I partnered with the county and Miami Beach and our Place-Based Foundation on a unified resilience strategy, and our heat action strategy will be monitored and implemented through that collaboration going forward, so that we will continue that level of collaboration. So all the cities, in addition to the metropolitan government, will be involved.
That great illustration, and that heat health task force, which I think is a common thread among the 3 of you, and one of our best recommendations for every community is to get your arms around it. Lenyo, let me turn to you and ask about you talked about the density of the city and the built out nature, not just the people but the buildings themselves. How do you discern vulnerability? If you're prioritizing most vulnerable, how are you thinking about that prioritization? And I know the city has done some really great work already to think about climate vulnerable, but let's talk about that for a minute. I think that's really important.
Sure. So we created a few years ago, not too long ago, with the
Thank you so much,
actually with the
Adrian,
assistance
for your
of the
vision,
Bloomberg
your leadership,
Associates
and your
and,
efforts
and a
to
few,
build resilience
during,
and save thousands of
our
lives
resilience
around the world.
journey in the city.
We're standing here
that
today
started a few years
with the
ago. We
COP26
created the
venue
map
behind us.
again because we identified, the people of Athens identified heat as one of the major challenges of the city. We created a map that brought together levels of heat in a specific couple of days, like where the heat was more intense in the city. And we correlated that to, we had a program for people that applied for food support. And this program, the people that applied for it had to be below the poverty level. So we had a very good sense through their zip codes of where what the dispersion was of these people in the city. So that's how we collected the data for socioeconomic vulnerability. And then we also kind of correlated that to where there are green spaces and how far from the green spaces we have schools or playgrounds or places where old people assemble. So this was a first kind of effort to map out the city. And now what we're trying to do is we're trying to go to a higher level of specificity and granularity. So we have actually commissioned a map for the city of Athens, which shows us block per block of the city where the most where are the real hotspots of the city and where the city is medium hot and where it's kind of the heat is lighter. And we really kind of know exactly where the pressures are, where the pressure points are in the city. And we are we have to connect this, which we haven't done yet, with a census that will give us, I believe, because the census is every 10 years. So 2021 is the year of the census. So we're expecting the census to come out. So we have like different population and socioeconomic kind of data that we can plug into this. Because this particular census, I think, is going to be better than the previous one. And the other thing that I really would like to get data from, which again is through collaborations with the universities, is energy poverty and how many air conditioning units are where and how much energy consumption, what types of levels of energy consumption we have at different parts of the city. So these will allow us to really create a map of vulnerability and exposure to risk for heat that will be much more specific and will be able to argue to the decision makers, to the mayor and to the deputy mayors, etc., every time to really try to target the different proposals of policies that we are creating to very specific areas where we have vulnerable population. And if I have time, one more minute, there's something else that's kind of interesting that I wanted to say and I forgot to say it, because it has to do with the fact that during COVID, the mayor of Athens, Mayor Bakoyannis, created an extended program that was called Help at Home Plus. So through that program, there was a lot of services that were given to older people, especially that live alone. So we have also a mapping of several hundred people that the municipality together with NGOs is supporting. And this is something that we're planning to kind of extend and expand. But it's kind of interesting because we have the type of information of vulnerability and a kind of mapping of vulnerability that before COVID we didn't have so extensive. So I think that's kind of interesting because it actually made people in the municipality more conscious of this notion of vulnerability and finding people where they need help where they are. So that.
Okay, Lenyo, that is all super insightful, and the interrelated nature of the, to talk about COVID, which gives us the view of things we didn't have before that makes us better prepared to help with climate impacts, really interesting. So Eugenia, let me turn to you for just a minute and talk about the, you mentioned 72 distinct settlements in Freetown and the notion of prioritizing them, but you have in the past, just in the past weeks, talked a lot about data and the importance of data. And so just tell me about how you're thinking about the types of data you'll need to prioritize and maybe in relation to those settlements, because I'm sure they're not all just the same. They're all vulnerable, but have different needs and different locations and different risks. And so, yeah, talk to me about that.
Yeah. So we do have 72 informal settlements in Freetown, and those are the most vulnerable. But one of the major challenges we have is in terms of data. And this is something that we need to enable us plan and strategize on how we move forward with the strategy that we are going to develop. This is going to help us to identify not only the gaps, but the needs. So within the next few weeks, we will be doing risk assessment analysis. with the support of the Hash Rock Resilience Center. And this will help us to kind of focus on the areas that we should be prioritizing. It will also help us to identify the most vulnerable within the communities. And it will also help us in putting forward our plans and strategy for the city.
The announcements that we made here this week is that we've partnered with a new initiative of Jupiter
hear you, Kathy.
Intelligence. They can't hear me. How about now? Sorry. Great, okay. A new initiative of Jupiter Intelligence called Jupiter Promise, and that is a specific effort to identify the climate risks that we are most concerned about, those that are heat, but then there are things related to heat, and then the socioeconomic pieces that help us better inform our strategies and investments for heat risk reduction. And so more to come on that. We're just kicking it off, but we'll be working in Miami-Dade on this and certain communities, and same in Freetown and in Athens. And I'll say for our audience that speaking of power and heat and resilience, Lenyo Mirvili's power has gone down, so we're hoping to see her back in just a moment. But for now, we've got Jane and Eugenia to keep the conversation going. So I wanted to now talk about challenges. This work is, as we've said, it's clear we know what to do, and we know that there is funding for this type of work, and it's not just philanthropy. This is a smart investment, and we'll be continuing to make that argument. And I do want to get to the economic side of heat and the worker productivity impacts, and the research that we'll be continuing with Vivid Economics to analyze more specifically certain sectors in your community, specifically to you, Jane, and Eugenia, and Lenyo and others. But can you talk to me, Jane, about the challenges of this work? We can't solve them all, and we can get into the solving part in the next part of our program. But talk to me about what do you think the biggest challenges are for you? And then Eugenia, I'll come to you next. Jane, I'm going to go to Eugenia. Eugenia, come back to me if you will, and let's go to you next. Thank you. And over to you, Eugenia. And you're on mute.
So thank you, Kathy. One of the biggest challenges we have in Freetown is in terms of the mindset and behavioral change. So when you talk about climate change, people relate it to flooding, people relate it to landslides and droughts and mudslides. They do not think about extreme heat as a climate hazard. And this is something that is really a challenge. People need to understand that the reason why the temperatures are rising is because it's a climate change issue. So we need to raise the awareness. We need to talk a lot about it. We need to get communities involved. We need to get communities on the process. And this is a very big challenge for Freetown. Another challenge which I've spoken about just now is in terms of data, but that is something that we will be working towards, because if you don't have the data, it's going to be very difficult as to how you prioritize and strategize and even assess yourself. So that's a difficult one. And another challenge is something that's I've heard the mayor of Freetown talked a lot about in many of the panels that she has been speaking on, is that this is an emergency. Climate change is happening all around the world and people are dying. People are losing their lives and people are losing their livelihood based on the impact of extreme heat. And so we need a revolution, and the revolution needs to be funded. So we need to ensure that funding is available to to implement the plans that we have, and to ensure that there are quick wins and adaptive measures that we'll use to help residents who are suffering currently from extreme heat to reduce the temperatures and to help them to go through what they're currently going through right now.
Here, and just on a note of equity, the people least responsible for those temperatures are those suffering the most from it. And so just in the note of funding, that's a very high on the list topic here at the COP about loss and damage and who's responsible and who should pay for it. And this is an opportunity for addressing inequality in the way that we invest in communities. Let me go back to you, Jane. Glad to see you both back. This is a resilient kind of group. So Jane, back to you on challenges, and Lenyo, the question is just a couple of the top challenges that you'll face, and then we might roll into audience questions. At that point, we'll have a few coming in. So Jane, over to you.
Sure. So first, at a national level is similar to our experience here in Miami. There's been a lot of focus on hurricane response and recovery investments and flooding response and investments. And we have a robust data and risk analysis related to flooding and hurricanes, et cetera. We don't have that kind of data and support or funding mechanisms at the federal level yet. There isn't that created yet. So that's something that we are in conversation with our national partners about that, and looking at how do we build heat into our local mitigation strategies and into our funding for physical infrastructure related to heat as an essential component of infrastructure. Locally, politically, we also, I'm part of the mayor's leadership team, and she works closely with a 13-member, single-member district commission that forms policy. And because it's been the silent killer, and because we've always been hot, not everybody's fully aware of some of the challenges and dangers. So as similar to Lenyo and Eugenia, we're creating a heat vulnerability analysis. We've already done the tree canopy and the vegetative assessments and the demographic overlays, but we're going to overlay that also with heat health data, which is also lacking because it's underreported, but we're going to do the best we can with that using excess hospitalizations, excess deaths information to better understand, not only as a whole metropolitan area, how we're vulnerable and where we're vulnerable to heat, but in those specific single member districts, what's their profile of heat, so that I can go and speak to those commissioners and say, here, these are some of the where people are at risk in their homes, at work, in the public spaces that you have, and work with them on prioritizing our next year heat season campaign so that they can be engaged and partners with us on that campaign.
Fantastic. Really clear. Thank you. Lenyo, over to you for some of the challenges you'll face, are facing, have faced. You're on mute. I'm coming to Athens and I'm going to permanently take that off.
We had a bit of a tiny blackout.
So tiny. In Scotland, we would call it a wee blackout.
A wee one. So I was thinking of, what's the vision for, and what are the challenges in relation to like how I developed this basic kind of 3 buckets of actions. So the first, there are 3 of them. So the first one is raising awareness. The second one is creating a preparedness plan. And the third one is making the city cooler. So cooling the city, making the city kind of cooler. So the first one is that the big challenge is that people don't take heat seriously. We're a city that always was hot, and people say, oh yeah, whatever, it's hot. It's a little more hot. It's kind of unbearable. But I don't think people understand what that means in relation to how dangerous it is. People don't realize how, because as Jane said, it's underreported. The heat-related deaths and injuries, et cetera, are definitely underreported. So people don't know what happened. So part of what I really believe will be great is this effort that we're doing with scientists in Athens and scientists from the ArsRock scientific committee to name and basically categorize heat waves. And Athens is going to be one of the first cities to do this. I think next year is going to be the first summer that we do this. And this is really important because we're actually creating methodology that links the meteorological data with the health data. So for policymakers, this is really important because categorizing heat waves is not just the fact that it's going to be a really hot heat wave, like, in the 5th percentile or 2% kind of occurrence of this type of heat, but it also will be linking the type of heat with the type of morbidity and mortality that we have seen in previous years, decades, like backcasting and figuring out what the patterns are and linking health basically or vulnerability to meteorological data, which I think is going to play a really important role and is going to help actually policymakers respond properly and people communicate properly what this is all about. And this, I think, is going to make a very big difference, very big importance. The other challenge, which has to do with and preparedness plan, is getting people to work together, which is not as easy. And I think there's a really lack of in Athens and in Greece, we have a lot of levels of government and a lot of different types of authorities, and it's really difficult to get like groups of different sectors and different levels of government to work together. I'm sure it's difficult everywhere. I feel like it's particularly a challenge in this city. And finally, the greening the city part. The biggest challenge, apart of course from funding, which is always a challenge for adaptation, as mentioned before, I think the biggest challenge is very fast building capacity for people to start doing things differently than they've done it up to now. And this is a really big challenge, both for the public sector and the private sector. People are used to doing things with cement. People are used to building gray infrastructure. They know how to make money out of it. They know how to fall back at solutions that are always linked with the way they've been doing things. So the biggest challenge, I think, is figuring out how to really build capacity, again, both in the private and the public sector, to teach people and to make people understand why it's cheaper and more effective to turn to blue and gray infrastructure. Blue and green. Green.
I knew what you meant. That all makes perfect sense. And I think we've got a few questions now that have come in, and let's maybe go back to Jane for a question that is how, and let me ask you each this question for a quick answer. How are people responding to the CHO role? What are you hearing? What are citizens saying? Or what do you, I know you had a county commission meeting, Jane, where it was discussed and the role was discussed. That's one venue. What are you hearing? And then I'll go to Eugenia and then back to you, Lenyo.
You know, from people on the ground, they're so excited. I mean, there's a lot of support from people on the ground for this role, and very excited that the lens and focus has been put on this, and from all walks of life, because it's affecting us all. It's affecting us all. I mean, yeah. My father-in-law 5 years ago was 84. Their house had lost power for 2 days in August, and he died of a heart attack during that time. It impacts everybody, and so when I read these 53 applications for our community member, to hear the stories of the teenager who passed out at a bus stop, or the construction worker who got permanent injury from falling off a ladder during a hot time, they're just numerous stories. People with pulmonary conditions in their home, not being able to pay their utility bill. So, but as Lenio said, we've always been a hot place, and there's so many priorities. Getting it to a level of a top priority in an elected official's mind. We did have comments when the mayor first appointed me as chief heat officer. What do we need a chief? We've always been hot, but
Yeah. Yeah.
and so, but they, as soon as by the budget hearings, and they heard from countless people coming before them applauding the mayor on appointing a chief heat officer and why, we didn't hear those comments anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there'll be fewer and farther between.
There'll be fewer, but it's an ongoing, to Lenio's point, it's an ongoing awareness campaign, and we really do need to elevate it.
Hear, hear.
To make sure everyone's aware, including my teenage son when he plays tennis. I mean, it's just everybody.
I know my husband too. I would try to keep him to stay in when it was 44 degrees, and he would not listen. He just went out, and he's like close to 70 these days.
We won't tell him that you revealed his
No.
age. Eugenia, how about you? What did people think when you were named the chief heat officer? What did they say around your community? You're on mute, my dear.
So people were just excited and very anxious, but a little bit confused, and setting like ambitious targets, like saying, "Oh yeah, you're the heat officer now for Freetown. So is the city going to be all green? Are the temperatures going to calm down?" And so we're also planning to do like a stakeholder workshop where we'll invite different people from different organizations to talk through like what this concept means and how we intend to work forward. Because people are excited, but they are also confused. Like, what are you going to do for us?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit on a couple of key things there, and one of them is the nature-based solutions. And Freetown, the Tree Town, which is an initiative of your city to plant 1 million trees for all of the good things they bring, is fantastic. And nature plays such a big role and is a cost-effective solution for heat, and does there's so many co-benefits, and all can be quantified and potentially monetized. And so it's one of the big solution sets. But I also wanted to talk about gender for a minute. And today is Cities Day, and 2 days ago was Gender Day here at the COP. And it's hard not to notice that we have 3 very powerful, fantastic women here in this role, in your role. And so let me ask you quickly about gender in your city, and then I've got one more final question from the audience, and we'll wrap up. So Lenio, let me start with you. What about gender in Athens?
I think it's kind of interesting because all of the people that I know that are related to adaptation, to climate adaptation, not mitigation so much, but climate adaptation issues, almost all of them are women. It's kind of an interesting fact, and I think it's
like marketing and HR. Like marketing and HR, they're usually led by women. A lot of times.
I think it's interesting because I hate to fall into stereotypes, so I won't go ahead and kind of expand on this, but it kind of takes a more long-term, a sense of long-term goals, and a sense of kind of long-term vulnerability, a sense of like a vulnerability that's more long-term, and a sense of creating condition, like worrying about creating conditions for the next decades, I think that are livable. I think is something that started worrying women earlier in my city. It started worrying men.
And all of the science shows it's not just that it worries them more, it impacts them more for a million reasons. And
that's true.
Women are 14 times more likely to die in a disaster than a man for a bunch of reasons. And women are responsible for getting water in many communities. And so the the garments that women wear. But let me go to Eugenia and ask just how does gender play a role in your thinking? And I know it's early, but what that feels like in Freetown, and then to you, Jane, and then we'll got one final question. Over to you, Eugenia.
This is very important and interesting because in Freetown we have a lot of outdoor working population, and most of those that are working outdoor are women who are involved in petty trading. They're out there in the street, exposed to extreme heat 24 hours. So as we think through the plans that we are putting forward for the city, we have that at the back of our mind to ensure that women are represented and they participate in all what we will be doing, and creating solutions that will also help them specifically.
That is super. Jane, quick thought from you on that.
Well, certainly we've been partnering with the Human Rights Watch and our local women's fund to raise awareness about the increasing, the new information that's come to the fore, the vulnerability of pregnant women to heat and their difficulties with both regulating heat and that it can lead to preterm births and other negative birth outcomes. And so we've been really prioritizing with our greening efforts to make sure playgrounds get not just man-made shade structures, which don't do nearly the level of cooling that trees do, to add trees to those areas. And it certainly was indicative of the number of female applicants I had for the community member. We did have men, largely our outdoor workers. We have a huge number of construction workers and farm workers. Farm workers can be pretty of both genders. Certainly the construction workers are more male dominated. But one of our researchers shared that there's a certain pride that men have that can make them more vulnerable, that they're not, they want to prove that they can withstand the heat and don't need that water and don't need that shade and break and whatnot. And then they end up with chronic kidney. So the gender issue can go both ways.
Yeah, that's really important. That really important point. So one last question for 20 seconds from each of you. A question from the audience is, what do you think you need what resources do you need from, whether it's inside or outside of your community? What are you going to need the most? What kind of help do you need? I know, Eugenia. I mean, there's resources. Yeah,
right?
Resources, yeah.
So, I mean, it's this mix of better data, better coordination, and resources. So I don't think it's exclusive, because resources without the other two can be misspent,
right,
and misdirected. And so you have to sort of think about it in conjunction with each other, because when I think of just the challenge of how do we help low-income people retrofit their housing to be more efficient and better air conditioning. Well, that's going to take government, private sector, nonprofit sector, and community members.
Right.
And so it's really going to take that kind of coordination and better data on where the housing is.
Right.
And so, but without that,
what good is money?
we need the money.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Eugenia, you're on mute.
My God. So I do agree with Jane, and definitely resources in terms of data, but also in terms of the capacity to deliver. So cities are different and they are dynamic. For Freetown, we need to, land is a big challenge, and so we need land and water. We need to come up with like creative ideas for us to deliver successfully and impact lives. So definitely coming up with creative ideas,
Wonderful.
having the capacity, but also the resources,
Hear, hear.
the funding
Yeah.
to deliver.
Here.
So I will just add one thing. All of the previous things that Eugenia and Jean said, I'm not going to repeat them, but also people that are brave and that they have the courage to lead and to take on this really, really hard issue on all levels of government and community and, you know, everywhere. We really need people that are willing to pull this difficult kind of issue forward.
That is a great way to close this session. We need brave people and bold action. I will say on behalf of the Adrienne Arsh Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Center, we are so proud to be your partner, to host you CHOs, and to help you learn from each other and share that knowledge out with the rest of the world in a hurry. This is urgent. I thank you very much for joining us today from Glasgow on the next to last day of the COP26, where the human life is finally a metric for climate action, and today we saw climate action at its finest. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you. We'll see you again soon.